Welcome to the Danny Goldberg Rock and Rolls Hour. In this podcast, Danny shares his longtime connection to the path of the heart, as well as his very engaged life of social activism. If you are interested in supporting Danny's podcast, please go to BeHereNowNetwork.com/Danny.
Okay, hi, this is Danny Goldberg, and this is Rock and Rolls, and I'm really excited today to be speaking to Robert Wright, whose current book, Why Buddhism Is True, is a bestseller, and having a bestseller about Buddhism, to me, is quite a rare occurrence. But beyond that, it's a book that really I have enjoyed reading because I've always been kind of intimidated by Buddhism. I felt I just wasn't quite disciplined enough or smart enough to be a Buddhist. But and this is a very a book for people like me. It really tries to meet people in the real world with Buddhism as opposed to coming from the mountaintop. What about this title, though? Why Buddhism is True? Does this mean that non-Buddhism is not true?
No, it doesn't mean that. And first of all, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate what you said about the book, because I very much wanted it to be a book that can introduce people to Buddhism, even if they're not very familiar with it. And if they are meditating a little, can maybe help them get a little further down the path. But the title, you are right to single out the title and raise questions about it, because it kind of invites criticism, if not disdain. I mean, it sounds a little, I guess ambitious would be the polite word.
Well, it sounds the danger. It's listen. It's a bestseller, so it's obviously a good title.
There is that to be said for the title.
But it sounds a little tribal, and I'm curious just how you frame it.
Yeah, well, I have a note to readers. I mean, there's a few kinds of attacks on the title that I anticipated. I try to defuse them all with a little note to readers at the beginning, kind of conveying what I mean by true. And one thing I say is this doesn't mean that I'm not talking about the part of Buddhism that would be incompatible with like other religions, because I'm not really talking about what you might call the supernatural part of Buddhism, reincarnation, and so on. I'm talking about a philosophy of life and a kind of, I guess you could say, a diagnosis of the human predicament. You know, what Buddhism thinks the challenge of living is, and a prescription for the human predicament. In other words, what Buddhism proposes to do about it. And I don't think these things are, broadly speaking, incompatible with major religions or anything like that. So I don't mean to be negating other worldviews. No.
Now, you grew up as a Christian, is that right?
That's right. I was brought up Southern Baptist.
And I read in the book that you had a hard time reconciling science with a kind of a literal interpretation of the in the book of Genesis and so forth. And I never really felt that the Bible was meant to be taken literally. I mean, it was written thousands of years ago in another language to start with, and I kind of process it, especially kind of Jesus's words, as a vehicle for light and not as a fundamentalist like follow the rules kind of a thing. But did you take anything from Christianity with you into this next stage of your life?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I suspect, for starters, that the fact that I no longer was a Christian, no longer had a kind of obvious spiritual home, maybe encouraged me to look into Buddhism and to go to my first meditation retreat, which kind of sold me on the practice of Buddhism in 2003. I also suspect that values that I kind of associate with Christianity continue to inform my worldview and maybe attracted me to Buddhism. And I think particularly, in my family, I would say the purest embodiment of what I took to be Christian values was probably my mother. And I like to think, I mean, I thought she really, walked the walk. I mean, I thought, she kind of represented the best of the Christian message. And I like to think that she would very much approve of kind of the moral take home of my book and pretty much of Buddhist philosophy. I see a real compatibility, certainly, between the Christian values I was taught, and Buddhist values.
I want to understand more what you mean by Buddhist values, and for one thing, we see these huge statues of Buddha, and that's one of the things that a lot of us think about when we think of Buddhism. We think of Buddha, and it's this statue of this person in a meditating pose with hands in a certain position. But then you write, and I keep reading about this idea of emptiness and transcending the idea of an individual self, and yet there's these statues of this actual human being. What's that all about?
There's a lot in that question, Danny. Okay, so there are these. I mean, first of all, broadly, what do I mean by Buddhist values in terms of seeing a connection between them and Christian values? Well, one big Buddhist value is concern for the well-being of all sentient beings. The idea that suffering anywhere is a bad thing, and you should try to do something to reduce the amount of suffering in the world. I see that as a value I saw in my mother's version of Christianity, and I see it in Buddhism. Now, well, actually, there's one other value that you wouldn't necessarily think of as central to Buddhism or Christianity, and this may sound surprising, but it's the importance of seeing things from other people's points of view, and cultivating an ability to see things from other people's view. Now, that is, I can think of some Bible verses that kind of point to that. And I would say that in Buddhism, it is at most implicit. It's not a really explicit value, but I very much see it as growing out of Buddhist practice. And I see it as one of the things the world most needs. I'm not talking about empathy in the sense of, emotional empathy, like feeling their pain. That can also be good. But I'm talking about what psychologists call cognitive empathy, just the ability to look at things from the point of view of any other human being, any other world leader, any marginalized teenager anywhere in the world, anybody. And I think that really is fostered by mindfulness meditation. And I think it, getting out of yourself is part of that, which turns this, I guess, into a segue into the most challenging part of the question you asked, which is you brought up these ideas of emptiness and not self. These are fundamental Buddhist ideas that I mean, first of all, the Buddhist idea is, look, we don't naturally see the world clearly. We have illusions about ourselves, about the world out there, and that's what makes us suffer, and that's what makes other people suffer. So if we could just clarify our vision through practices like meditation, we would suffer less, and we'd be better people. Now, two of the central illusions in Buddhism are an illusion about the self, that thinking that there's much more in me in the way of a solid kind of CEO in charge self than there is. And then this illusion that we're covering a lot of ground here, but the one that you allude to with the concept of emptiness. And I should probably take one of those at a time. So if you do want me to elaborate on either, do you have a preference? I can get to both eventually.
You'll get to both in whatever way you want to get to it. I just want people to understand what you're thinking and get a glimpse into what they'll find in the book.
Okay. Well, as long as we were already on a kind of a moral plane and talking about values, let me let me talk about emptiness a little. They both have moral implications. In theory, according to Buddhism, both seeing the emptiness in the world and seeing not self, seeing that you are not the self you thought you were, make you a better person. But let's just because emptiness sounds in a way the most mystifying, the more mystifying of the two concepts, because it probably doesn't connote anything at all to most people. Let me give you an example of something that happened to me on my first meditation retreat. This is a week-long silent meditation retreat in 2003. I had never meditated with anything like what I considered success. I have a short attention span. I'm not a natural meditator. I finally went on a week-long retreat. By day 4 or 5, I was starting to feel like my consciousness had been transformed after a couple of days of very frustrating failure to focus on my breath. But I finally got in a kind of zone, and I was taking a walk in the woods.
And this involves a lot of silence, right, this retreat?
Yeah, you don't talk to anybody, and you don't get any news from the outside world. You shouldn't bring your smartphone. You shouldn't be getting any put your email on auto reply. You are in a cone of silence, as they used to say on Get Smart. You hear a Dharma talk every evening, and then like a couple of times in the week, you have the opportunity to check in with a teacher to make sure nothing's going horribly wrong. But it's basically silence. It's like 7 days. The longest I've done is 2 weeks in silence and meditating like about 5.5 hours a day, sitting meditation, and another 5.5 hours a day walking meditation. So it's pretty intense. And by the end of the week, it had been, I felt, transformative. But I was taking a walk through the woods, and I saw a weed that called a plantain weed, which I had been trying to eradicate for years now because it had infested my lawn. And I just suddenly had this feeling like, wait, why have I been trying to kill this weed? It looks just as beautiful as all the other plants in the forest. Now, at one level, this is a trivial observation in a sense, because when you think about it, obviously weeds are a category that human beings made up, right? It's not like it says weed on their DNA.
Right.
It's just some people in some cultures said, I don't particularly want that kind of plant in my garden. That's a weed.
Right.
But at another level, it was a very significant, if subtle, shift in my whole perception of the thing. And I no longer felt, and it is partly a feeling, I no longer felt essence of weed when I looked at a weed. And that is what emptiness is. It is the idea that things don't actually have essences. Human beings have been kind of trained, and they do this by nature. It doesn't take a lot of persuasion. They tend to see essences in things, and that and it's so subtle they don't.
So it's like kind of seeing things through colored glasses.
Yeah, you don't notice it until it's gone. I had never thought that I was seeing essence of weed, and suddenly when it's gone, you're like, whoa. It's a different way. This allows me to see beauty in the weed. I had always gotten this negative vibe from this weed that prevented that. Now, this, with a lot of things that you see essence in, plants, cars, lamps, the moral stakes aren't that high. But when you move to the human realm and you start, perceiving entire ethnic groups, for starters, as having some kind of vibe, that is called essentialism, right? And the reason is because you're subtly imposing an essence on them. And it also happens with individuals. It's like, that guy's my enemy. That guy's my rival. These aren't just words. They are perceptual shifts. They involve the perception of a kind of essence that then shapes the way you think about them and process information about them. And I think this is one thing that, when you have a situation like America today, is very tribalized, politically polarized, or you have a situation like the sectarian conflict in the Middle East, or just like conflict between nations, this kind of perceptual phenomenon becomes very important in fomenting and then sustaining conflict.
If I could interrupt with a question, though, about this idea of emptiness and seeing things without what you call essence. There's a cosmology that I, use in my head a lot, and I guess it comes from, I don't know, Hindu stuff or, hippie stuff, of kind of differentiating between the ego and the soul. and that the ego to me is the repository of these biases and this programming, and that behind that there's something that, for want of a better word, is a soul that's sort of on one level who I really am, and then and then I guess there's the whole essence of the universe, which would also include everybody. But is there not an in-between thing between the sort of between sort of the tribalism and the ego world and the merging with everything world? Do you have this notion of a soul, or is that a contradiction of the emptiness vibe?
That's a very good distinction to make between ego and soul, because what I would say is, I mean, I can't, well, I would say, for starters, for practical purposes, the way to think about the not self idea is in terms of ego. That is, in my book, when I go through, I get into what the Buddha supposedly actually said about not self in his first seminal sermon about not self, and was he really saying that the self doesn't exist, or was he really just offering? And some scholars think that he wasn't really asserting that the self doesn't exist, as came to be the mainstream Buddhist interpretation, but he was just really suggesting that it will be valuable to you. You will become a happier and better person if you look at a lot of the contents of your mind and say, I don't think I want to identify with that.
Right.
Like
right.
anxiety, hatred, a lot of the things that kind of either constitute or emanate from the ego, depending on how you want to look at it, just you can let those go, and meditation is a discipline for letting them go. And I think that's the kind of, practically valuable way to think of this not self thing, is as a kind of a prescription for progress in meditation that involves kind of deconstructing the ego. Now, I think, as a matter of fact, although Buddhist philosophy is more kind of diverse and more characterized by internal disagreement than people may realize, I think it's fair to say, in general, no, Buddhist philosophy doesn't buy into the concept of the soul the way Hindus do. And in fact, you mentioned this issue of the soul merging with kind of the universal soul. In Hinduism, it's Atman equals Brahman, right?
Right.
And I had an experience that I describe in the book at a meditation retreat, which super advanced meditators tell me is like closer to the way they experience the world the whole time. Okay. And the experience was almost like the bounds of myself were dissolving. I was sitting there meditating. It was like probably fifth or sixth day of my third or fourth retreat. And I was feeling a tingling in my foot, and I was hearing a bird singing. And suddenly it felt like the bird was no less a part of me than the tingling, and the tingling was no more a part of me than the bird. It was as if my identity no longer stopped at the bounds of myself as I conventionally think of it. There was more continuity of identification and concern. I would be more concerned about the bird's welfare than I might have been before feeling this. And one thing I note in the book is that the way a Hindu interprets, the official Hindu way to interpret that type of experience, is as a merger of Atman with Brahman, as I understand it. Whereas Buddhists, because of this, kind of strange sounding feature of Buddhist philosophy of denying the existence of the self, they would not put it that way. They would say that it's more like there's an expanse of emptiness that you're experiencing. Now, for my money, I don't see how the particular interpretive twist matters so much, because in both cases, you're identifying more with the rest of the world as a practical matter.
Right. And you're less identifying with a narrow set of personality traits.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that, at some of the Ram Dass retreats that I've been to, he has a lot of Buddhists and he has Bhakti Hindus. And at one point, somebody listening, and he gives Buddha sort of 2/3 of the time, because I think he figures he can stand in for the Bhakti himself. And at some point, somebody said, What's the difference exactly between this emptiness you talk about and universal love? They sound a lot like the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Right.
so they're just different words. And again, since there's so many different languages anyway, and we just happen to be speaking English, what you know, I agree that there's the commonality. The deeper I get into it, the more commonality there is and the less separation between these different paths. But I don't want to get away from the question I asked a few minutes ago. What's with all these statues?
Well, one thing to remember is that in Asia, Buddhism is a real religion that is a lot more like the Western religions we're familiar with than we may realize. Now, my book is not about that part of Buddhism because, as I said, I don't get into the supernatural stuff. But you know, Westerners a lot of Westerners think that Buddhists are people who meditate and don't believe in God. If you're talking about Asian Buddhists, that's almost the opposite of the truth. Most Asian lay Buddhists do not meditate. Many Asian Buddhist monks do not meditate,
Mm.
and almost all lay Buddhists do believe not in a single omnipotent creator God as in the Abrahamic religions, but they do believe in deities. They say prayers, they ask for things, and they hope that good conduct in this life will help them in the afterlife, in this case in the form of a favorable rebirth. So, you know, and I think if you ask why did there come to be all of these statues of the Buddha all over the place, I think the answer as to why those have so flourished over the last 2.5 millennia is that Buddhism has been a religion in Asia in a pretty conventional sense, and you know, just so same reason you see a lot of crosses in the world. You know, Christianity has also been a very successful religion. Now, in Western Buddhism, you know, the kind of more, some people use the word secular Buddhism. I think of it as kind of naturalistic Buddhism in the sense that it, you know, there's nothing supernatural involved. You know, at the retreat centers where this kind of Western Buddhism happens and people, you know, meditate a lot, you often see a statue of the Buddha. And as for why that is, I mean, look, the Buddha, the figure of the Buddha is authentically connected to the the tradition of philosophy and
To
in
the
a way psychology.
yeah, to the teachings. It's a way of reminding
Sure, it's
oneself and
it's it's
tuning
a
into
it's
the
a
teachings.
valuable
Yeah.
icon, whether it's Western or Asian Buddhism. It's a good icon.
And personally, uh, is the book, which again is extremely welcoming to Westerners, and I think that's why it's doing so well. Is it meets people wherever they are, and does not seem at all, and does not impose some foreign mysticism on people. And I say that as someone who loves and identifies with foreign mysticism, but but um, but is that a reflection of your beliefs, or is that part of a wider group of beliefs that you decided to put into this book for the purposes of the book?
Oh, I think my book is pretty representative of this kind of Western Buddhism.
But in terms of
It's
what you personally, when you're not doing a podcast and you're not promoting the book and you're just in the privacy of your own thoughts, is this sort of sum up your views, or is it one branch of a group of views?
It's been so long since I wasn't promoting the book that I've forgotten what the real me is like. But no, I mean, I buy into it, and I try in the book. I try to be, you know, pretty clear about the parts of it that I either don't get. Like I say in the book, you know, not self. If you mean it in the most extreme sense, then you know the self doesn't exist. What would that mean in the most extreme sense of doctrine? I don't get it. You know, I can't.
Right.
There are paradoxes when you start trying to, and I outline what some of the paradoxes are. I'm like, look, the first question you're going to ask is, when the Buddha says, if you let go of all of the parts of the self, you are liberated. Well, who is you if you've let go of everything that constitutes the self? You know, right? There shouldn't be anything left to be liberated in theory. So there are these paradoxes, and I just when I run into those and they don't make sense to me, I just say that. At the
Yeah,
same
yeah.
time, I think Buddhism's diagnosis of the human predicament about how pervasive and recurring like unsatisfactoriness is. And by the way, the term dukkha that is often translated as suffering, when you hear people say the Buddha said that life is full of suffering, the term dukkha that's translated as suffering could also be translated as unsatisfactoriness. And I think that's, in a way, I mean, some scholars think that that would be a solid translation, and I think that gets so things. It picks up on what I think really are the problems. We do misperceive the world. We have illusions about ourselves, illusions about other people. We try to cling to pleasures that are not going to last, and all of these things Buddhism says, I think, are the core things are fundamentally true.
True, yes.
And by the way, I wrote a book about evolutionary psychology in the 90s, and that was what led me to believe they're true, because what evolutionary psychology says about the brain as designed by natural selection meshes very well with the Buddhist predicament. It's like, yeah, natural selection built us to be unsatisfied, so we would keep pursuing, food and sex and status and stuff, right? We're designed to do that, but we're not designed to be happy, and that quest is not going to lead to enduring happiness.
Yeah, you write a lot about Darwin, and again, one of the virtues of the book is that it's very embracing of the theory of evolution and people with scientific minds and who are committed to that view of the world. And I've certainly got nothing against Darwin, but I'm puzzled by this idea. On the one hand, it's always sort of described, and you described this a fair amount, as it's kind of the purpose of these inbred impulses or propagation of the species, sending the genes on to the next generation. And then on the other hand, there's an enormous amount of self-destructiveness in human beings in this era of humanity, whether it's individual self-destructiveness, suicides, drug abuse, overeating, meanness, and in terms of societies, wars, global warming, and so on. So why is all of these genes that are so into the propagation of the species building nuclear arsenals?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. I mean, for starters, remember that evolution isn't, in a sense, it's not really for the good of the species by and large. I mean, the bulk of the competition that drives natural selection takes place within the species. One individual has genes that are slightly different from the individual who lives next door in the same hunter-gatherer village or whatever. And if those genes are slightly more conducive to getting the genes into the next generation, then they will flourish. So there are genes for intense competition. Genes seem to foster intense competition among people, even combat, in the sense of fighting with other people for status and for mates and for, sometimes for food. Although I would say there's a lot of cooperative impulses that are also natural. And love is part of our, endowment and compassion and so on. But there is a competitive part, and there is the fierce competition for status that seems to be natural. And then, technology slowly transforms our environment, and we find ourselves in a world that we weren't designed by natural selection to live in, because, and I use designed in quotes because natural selection is not like a thinking process, but it does kind of metaphorically design things, but it didn't design us for this environment. And that accounts for a lot of our self-destructive behavior, a lot of the way addictions play out with, first of all, with chemicals that were not available during evolution, that natural selection couldn't anticipate, with internet addictions that were not part of the environment. We have new kinds of anxieties to deal with. Because of the modern environment. And as you know, we have slowly built these weapons that are in the hands of people who have unfortunate features like refusing to back down. People don't like to lose face. And right now the White House is occupied by someone who carries that to a pathological level. And so basically you get, we weren't designed in the first place to be all about love and mutual understanding, although those capacities are within us. And I think meditation is one way to give them freer play. But we also have this kind of dark, competitive, deeply competitive, even violent side. and then you put that in an environment that's nothing like the environment that the organism was designed for, and bad things can happen. And that's why I personally think we need some kind of revolution in consciousness, whereby more and more people become aware of that some of the natural workings of the mind are unfortunate, and that if you want a truly clear view of the world, and a morally better view of the world, and also a view of the world that will make you happier, you have to learn to transcend some of the kinds of cognitive biases that are built into us. And I think that's a lot of what meditation is about.
Do you think that set of tools and attitude about the mind could be brought into Christianity? Because just mathematically in the United States, I mean, the majority of people identify as Christians. It's a smaller group than it used to be, but it's still a very big part of the psychology of the country. And I think about Christianity a lot. I think about the words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, and the feeling I get when I think about Jesus is so beautiful and so consistent with any other mystical set of beliefs I have. And yet somehow the way it's practiced, and this is human beings get in the middle. This is true of all, whether it's the Enlightenment, Buddhism, Hinduism, we screw it up, human beings. But I just wonder if these ideas could be integrated more. You don't have to give up Jesus to meditate, right?
Right. Oh, absolutely. And I mean, there's a couple of things. First of all, yeah, a lot of the teachings are quite consonant with my takeaway from Buddhism. There's a number of passages you could cite, but even the one where Jesus says, "Oh, hypocrite, why are you obsessed with the speck in your, I don't know, your brother's eye or your friend's eye or whatever, when you have like a huge log in your own eye? In other words, your vision is not clear, and you're focusing on, and there's all kinds of things, or the lilies of the field. The point being, look, just focus on the moment. Tomorrow's troubles are sufficient, for tomorrow. Don't worry, and there's all kinds of teachings that can be put to that use. And I would say two things. First of all, there are people who consciously fuse Buddhism and Christianity. There's a book by a guy named Paul Knitter, Knitter, who is an emeritus at Union Theological Seminary in New York, where I have an affiliation myself, and which also has a Buddhism degree program, by the way. And his book is called "Without Buddha, I Could Not Be a Christian." And then there's also, I think, kind of the smuggling in of some of this stuff into Christianity, just not under the name of Buddhism. I mean, I have a still, my siblings are to varying degrees still Christian. And I know one of them has done some meditating, and she just thinks of it as like mindfulness, not Buddhist mindfulness, but it's still meditating. And so you get a lot of that. And you even hear the language of mindfulness in sermons sometimes. So, I don't care about the label. I mean, it's true that my book, as you pointed out, is called "Why Buddhism Is True." But I don't really, my point is that the ideas in there are valid. And if you want to put another label on them and practice them, fine.
Now, you quote William James, who's in his book, The Varieties of Religions of Experience, talked about an unseen order. So do you think there's an unseen order in the universe?
I think there's a couple of candidates for that. James was trying to come up with a conception of religion that was broad enough to encompass not only all the conventional religions that were already in play, but also I think he was concerned with paving the way for what you might call modern, more modern religions. And so he said the essence of religion is the idea that there's an unseen order, and that our supreme interest lies in harmoniously adjusting to that order. And I say in the book, Buddhism does posit a kind of order, and it's that tends to be unseen, which is this. It says there is a natural convergence between the truth about the world, about just the objective truth about what is actually out there, and moral truth, and well-being or happiness. And because, in other words, if you pursue this path of clarifying your vision through meditation and other disciplines, you will more closely approximate the actual truth about the world. The world you see and the you see will be closer to the actual truth, and your behavior, especially if guided by Buddhist ethical precepts, will come into closer compliance with moral truth. So there's a kind of order there that can be achieved that we don't often think of, but it's there. And so I think you could view that as a kind of unseen order. I've talked in the past about other candidates for an unseen order that I needn't get into here, but I mean, look, the universe, I think that claim is basically right, that there can be this convergence of clarity about the world, moral clarity, and well-being. And the universe didn't have to be built that way, right? I mean, I think that's something it's a kind of, you could say, structure in the world that we can take advantage of and that we should be thankful for.
I want to ask you to talk a little bit more about morality and ethics, whatever. I understand from what you're saying that the compassion for all beings is part of Buddhism, and I've heard that, and I believe it, and I think Buddhists in general are very kind people. But I don't quite understand where the connective tissue is between emptiness and morality and compassion. How do those things connect?
Well, in a way, the more obvious connection of these two great, Buddhist claims about illusion that I spend time on in the book, Not Self and Emptiness. One is more emphasized in what's called Theravadan Buddhism, and that's not self. And emptiness is more emphasized in Mahayana Buddhism, I would say. Although not self is certainly emphasized in both, and to some extent, emptiness. But there is a difference of emphasis, and I would say, for starters, the more obvious connection with morality is in the not self idea, right? Because you're letting go of these selfish impulses, and not just obviously selfish impulses like, I want to eat that junk food. I want to get this promotion and make sure the other guy doesn't get it. And so on. Much subtler perceptions almost that are self-serving, but are so subtle you don't notice them. And that kind of leads to emptiness, how emptiness could make you a better person, because emptiness is partly about how self-serving feelings subtly shade your perception of other people, including the people that are your enemies, your rivals, including the people that you've convinced yourself are bad, even though you don't know much about them, the people you've convinced yourself deserve to suffer, even though your grounds for believing that are actually pretty slim. So to see emptiness would be, for one thing, to not see that kind of essence of bad person that you are projecting on to people very often with limited, on the basis of very limited evidence, and projections that are ultimately just self-serving. It's because you and this guy want the same girl or something, or whatever. That is shading your whole moral calculus about this person in an ultimately self-serving way. And if you truly saw the emptiness in the world, and by the way, not many people ever see this in a thoroughgoing way, although I've talked to some people who seem to see it in a pretty thoroughgoing way, and they're in the book. But if you saw true emptiness, you wouldn't see these people in these self-servingly biased ways, and that's where the moral implication comes. And when somebody, let's take war. When somebody tries to convince you to, in the course of trying to convince you to invade Iraq in 2003, they try to demonize the leader as much as possible. Then if you didn't see emptiness, you would be capable of saying, you wouldn't get wrapped up in the rhetoric. You'd go, Saddam Hussein has done some bad things. There's no doubt about that. But rather than let me try to draw me into a perception of him that gives me the gut feeling that we just have to kill him, let's look at this rationally. and ask what purpose is served by inventing a rock, and so on. So I think, emptiness, both not self and emptiness, permit a more kind of level-headed assessment of the moral universe.
Well, it
And
sounds a little more like rationality to
it
me
is.
than morality. Are
Well,
those?
it's rational morality. I mean, if you ask me, uh, a lot of, I mean, immorality is a failure of rationality at
Mm,
some level,
mm,
I
right.
mean, I think most philosophers, if you ask them what ethical system they subscribe to, after they told you, if you said, well, is that rational? They say, of course, that's what we want a rational ethical system.
Yeah.
And we want people to then be able to pursue the values it posits in a rational, clear-headed way, and not to get drawn into these like primitive reactions that natural selection built into us. And meditation helps us transcend those kinds of reactions. And both not self and emptiness, as strange as they sound, are kinds of perceptions that facilitate the clear assessment of things, unadulterated, or at least as little adulterated as possible, by these primitive instincts.
Now, you come back again and again in the book to this retreat that you went to in 2003 that was, I guess, a turning point in your self-identification with Buddhism and meditation. And you refer many other times to these retreats. Why the need for a retreat? Why the need to be in a group of people in a structured way? Why not just meditate on your own?
I do. First of all, I do
No, I mean,
meditate on my
obviously,
own.
I know you do, but what is it particularly about this group experience that's a link on the chain of the path that you write about?
Well, I think, as a lot of people who meditate have found, it's not always easy to sustain a daily practice, even if you're convinced that, even if you see that, when I do spend the 30 minutes on the cushion every morning, or 20 or 40 or whatever it is, the day seems to go better. I say fewer regrettable things, and I see a little more beauty in the world, and so on. Even if you see that, it still can be hard. There will be days when you've got a lot to do, you don't have time, and it's easy to kind of fall off the path.
Mm.
And there are a couple of ways to reinforce a practice that involve community. One is to find a group of people in your literal physical community, your geographic area, who meditate every week, and make that a ritual where you are part of this community, and that helps sustain your daily practice. I don't have one of those, so it is helpful to me to just, every year or so. I've
Mm.
averaged slightly less than one retreat a year over the last 7 or 8 years. Every year or so, go on a retreat that, if all goes well, and it usually does, provides you a major recharge, for your practice. Um, and then in addition to that, aside from its value in sustaining a daily practice, it's just an intense and interesting experience. It's like extreme sports for the mind. And it can give you, like we talked about not self and emptiness. Well, the number of people who actually walk around the world apprehending it through those kinds of lenses, the lenses of not self and emptiness, is very small, because you have to be really committed to meditation for that to be very likely to happen. But I do think that on a retreat, you can have brushes with those experiences and get a much better sense of what the deeper version of the experience is like. And one benefit of that, this also connects back to your daily practice, because then you realize more deeply that, hey, when I let go of some anxiety, that's not just therapeutic. It is therapeutic. When I just kind of observe my anxiety and choose not to identify with it, and it no longer makes me suffer, um, that is of therapeutic value, but it's also an incremental step toward the apprehension of not self, because it's a part of you that you had previously thought of as part of you. And then for that few minutes or that day or whatever, you're not thinking of it as part of you. It is therapeutic, but it's also a step toward what is in Buddhism a very deep and philosophically significant achievement, the full-on apprehension of not self.
Mm.
And so too with, like, if you just don't see essence of jerk in someone, like some guy is rude in the checkout line in front of you, and you refrain from, and the truth is you don't know why, whether he's habitually rude or he just found out that his spouse has cancer or what. You don't know why he's being rude at that moment. If you refrain from seeing like essence of jerk in him, I would say that is an incremental step toward emptiness. So I think going on retreat can give you an intuitive approximation of a more intuitive sense of what these really deep apprehensions are like, and that can help you see a connection between what you can do with a daily practice and kind of the deepest parts of Buddhist philosophy.
Yeah, I found for many, many, many years, I convinced myself that I couldn't meditate, and that I'm so grateful you defined yourself as ADD in the book, because it gives courage to those of us that look at ourselves that way. But I found, because I was touched by Ram Dass's devotion to his guru, and I had a teacher named Hilda Charlton that was devoted to her guru, that I could pray. And so for decades, people would say, do you meditate? I said, I don't always meditate. I meditate occasionally, but I always remember to pray. Because to me, the idea of tuning into this unseen order was better than nothing. And it got me, and then for no reason that I'm conscious of, a few years ago, now I just meditate every morning. I don't quite always get up to 40 minutes, but it's always more than 20. And it's been a tremendously positive thing in my life. It's now to the point, if I don't do it, my day is screwed up. So I am very grateful for that, and I think it's very good. Anything that gets people to do that by whatever path is a huge contribution. But I would just like to end, if you could talk about something that I've read you talk about in interviews and in the book, because I think it's so helpful. Because a lot of people I know feel, I'm just not a good enough person, I'm not smart enough, I'm not disciplined enough to actually become enlightened, so what's the point? And I love this idea of yours that, half a loaf is better than none. And so could you talk about that a little bit of enlightenment is still better than nothing? And
yeah, I mean, I think, enlightenment, you can think of it as a state, and in a Buddhist context, that's the way people usually think of it. It's like, oh, it's this threshold that if I just meditate forever, maybe I'll suddenly cross over into, right? Enlightenment. I'll see things with perfect clarity. I will be liberated from suffering. Nirvana, great. But you can also think of enlightenment as a process, which is another thing that the word literally means, right? Getting more enlightened than you were before. And any increment of clarifying your vision, I think you should think of as qualifying as enlightenment.
Right.
And that's why I want people to think, to keep in mind these deep Buddhist concepts of not self-emptiness and so on, and other ones, and not think that they failed if they don't get all the way. Because very, 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 very few of us have realistic aspirations of getting all the way, to say the least. But I think you should use the word enlightenment, or at least feel free to think in those terms unashamedly, and be happy if your view of the world is getting clearer, and if it's making you happier and a better person, as I think it will, that's a great bonus.
Fantastic way to end. I thank you so much for spending this time with me, and I urge anyone listening to this to read the book, whether you think of yourself as Buddhist or not. It's a great read, and it is itself enlightening.
Thank you, Danny. I really appreciate it. Great questions and a great conversation.
Cool. All right, later. Bye-bye.